Greetings, everybody. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers. I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of the week-long festival called Revisions, Decoding Technological Bias. This is the 3rd session of the festival. Over the course of the next few days, we will be presenting lectures, discussions, and workshops focusing on the ways in which technological bias shapes our cultural realities. A network of activists, educators, critical theorists, designers, and programmers will come together to share new perspectives and develop new visions advocating for justice and reclaiming power. Before we begin, I would like to bring attention to the good work of our partners and co-producers in this weekend's endeavor. City Lights is honored to be working alongside Goethe Institute San Francisco and Gray Area in bringing you this remarkable program. Goethe Institute San Francisco is the cultural arm of the Federal Republic of Germany. Their programs encourage intercultural dialogue and enable cultural involvement. They aim to strengthen and develop structures in civil society and foster worldwide mobility. It is a great pleasure to be once again working with Bettina Wodianka and her colleagues and bringing you this exciting program. The festival is part of a project called Image and Bias, which originated with Bettina and her colleagues, and that critically engages with the cultural realities being increasingly determined by these kind of imperceptible technologies. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to our friends at Gray Area, our co-producer of this festival. They are the perfect medium where something like revisions can flourish. Gray Area is a cultural center and an educational hub located in San Francisco's Mission District. Their mission is to apply art and technology to create social and civic impact through education, incubation, and public events. They use digital tools to create art and design projects that benefit society. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Nadav Hochman and his colleagues at Gray Area for all their good work. It's been a pleasure working with them in the past, and City Lights is honored and thrilled to be working with them once again on this really fantastic project. So our opening session today is titled Coding Democracy: How Hackers Are Disrupting Power, Surveillance, and Authoritarianism. It is being presented by Maureen Webb. Maureen Webb is a human rights attorney and activist. She has spoken extensively on post-9/11 security and human rights issues, most recently testifying before the House and Senate committees reviewing the Canadian Anti-terrorism Act. In 2001, she was a fellow at the Human Rights Institute at Columbia University in New York, a litigator for some of the first constitutional cases heard under Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including the landmark Freedom of Association case, Levine, and a case challenging the powers of Canada's newly instituted spy agency, CSIS. She sits as co-chair of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. She is also the coordinator for security and human rights issues for Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada, and she is the author of Illusions of Security: Global Surveillance and Democracy in Post-11 World. It's published by City Lights, as it turns out, so she is no stranger to us. We've featured her before, so it's really a great pleasure to have her here again. And her most recent book is called Coding Democracy: How Hackers Are Disrupting Power, Surveillance, and Authoritarianism, and it's published by MIT Press. Ms. Webb has taught national security law as an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia. So it's really a great honor to be in her orbit once again. Her presentation is going to be followed by a Q&A, so please do post your questions and comments in the Q&A window of your Zoom dashboard. And we're going to be posting additional links in the chat function with which you may purchase Ms. Webb's book. So Maureen Webb, it is a great pleasure to see you again. It's been a long, long time since Illusions of Security. So really so great to be with you again. Very glad you could be part of this.
Oh, great to see you, Peter, and very happy to be collaborating again with City Lights. And thank you to the Goethe Institute and the Gray Area as well. I'll get right into it. I think I will start the talk today by restating the premise of the festival. And that is that our cultural consumption is increasingly being shaped by undetectable forces that determine our reality. And this includes algorithms that make opaque decisions about us and are constantly socially sorting us, micro-targeting that delivers us different content and messages, big data that's taking over governance functions with its many unexamined assumptions and correlations, machine learning that's so opaque that it can barely be reverse engineered, networks that virally spread disinformation and misinformation, images and memes that play on our deep neural wiring, And of course, the latest fast developing threat of deep fakes or synthetically created photos and videos that soon, experts tell us, even AI may not be able to detect. And the question posed by the festival is, how can we expose the bias and manipulation embedded within technology, digital technology, that threaten our democracies in the West? What innovative approaches can we take to counter them? And my focus today will be on particularly information dysphoria, how tech is helping to induce it, how it is a tactic of authoritarian regimes that has migrated to the West, and what we need to do to counter it. I'm going to talk about some of the principles that hackers have been fighting for that will be essential in countering information dysphoria. And I'll evaluate some of the tech and legal solutions that have been put forward and how far they take us. But my overarching point today will be that while societies used to be able to manufacture consent, as Noam Chomsky might say, now in this much more complex landscape, the urgent question is really, how do we manufacture consensus? And my conclusion may be surprising to you, having just written a highly technical book for MIT Press. My conclusion will be that really only culture can help us with this. Technical and legal solutions will have something to contribute in confronting information dysphoria in the 21st century, but really if it's liberal democracy that we're wanting to preserve, then it's the values within that tradition that we need to draw deeply on now, especially, I would argue, the liberal democratic value of preserving a space where people with different political viewpoints can talk to each other and conduct politics. So let me just give you a little bit about my background, tell you a little bit about my research and where I'm coming from. I'm as Peter indicated, I'm a labor and a constitutional lawyer, a Canadian. And my latest book, Coding Democracy, How Hackers Are Disrupting Power, Surveillance, and Authoritarianism, published just recently by MIT Press, reports on a phenomenon in the political landscape that many have been missing: the rapid spread of hacker culture and its potency to disrupt the concentrations of power, mass surveillance, and growing authoritarianism that have become the defining features of these first decades of the 21st century. The book provides the reader with a one-stop history of hackers and the genealogy of hacker ideas, but at its heart is my reporting on the burgeoning progressive hacker scene coalescing around the Chaos Computer Club in Germany, and how hacking is starting to be embraced by citizens as a practice, an ethos, and a metaphor. And in this sense, hacking is really a new kind of social activism, which is all about distributed power, distributed decision-making, and distributed democracy. The title, Coding Democracy, alludes to the hacker thesis that Larry Lessig of Harvard Law famously expounded on, the idea that code is law. That is, that in a world of ubiquitous computing, the self-executing nature of code will largely determine our relationships and rights, and even undermine constitutional guarantees if we do not pay attention to it. And in many ways, that's the theme of this festival. The book does not take a utopian or deterministic view of technology. It's not about techno-solutionism, although it reports on a vast array of hacker experiments that could fundamentally transform our political economy. It really places agency very much in the hands of people. So coding democracy means also, what do citizens need to put in place in the digital age to make democracies work? How can societies hold on to and build out democracy in the digital age? And this, I argue, is the project of the contemporary progressive hacker scene and the broader hacker movement. So what is this problem of information dysphoria? In the mid-20th century, of course, the mainstream media monopolized a scarce resource, radio and television waves, and it had a commercial incentive to try to capture the broadest possible audience. Its reporting was presented as objective, and people consumed more or less the same information and messages from it. Today, the entire media sphere, as we know, is fragmented. The audience for the surviving mainstream media is almost entirely divided. A recent Pew study showed that 93% of people who say Fox is their primary news source describe themselves as Republicans, and 95% of MSNBC viewers are Democrats, as are 91% of the New York Times readers. And then you add our news feeds and online consumption of alternate news sources, and you get not merely a divided information environment, but a chaotic one. There's no longer 2 nightly news channels in every household reporting more or less the same thing. And trusted figures like Peter Mansbridge in my country or Walter Cronkite in yours, comfortingly wishing us a good night, everyone, at the end of the evening. Today, we are living in a technologically enabled world of narrowcasting. Media companies now make their money targeting smaller and smaller slices of the population, and by pumping up their engagement, stirring up fear and anger. We're living in a world of political micro-targeting. The great scandal of Brexit and the 2016 US election was the revelation that Cambridge Analytica and its partner company were able to scrape the personal information of Facebook users in order to micro-target them on an industrial scale with tailored political messages. And that the Obama campaign had done a similar scraping and targeting before in the 2008 election. We're in a world of viral disinformation campaigns perpetrated by foreign powers. While Russia still leads in the extent and sophistication of its disinformation operations, it's estimated that 70 or more countries are now participating in disinformation operations now, including China, which has stepped up its game. The US is especially vulnerable to viral disinformation campaigns with its large monopoly platforms that can be weaponized against it, and its longstanding politically polarizing culture wars that can be exploited by foreign actors. And finally, we're living in a world of deep fakes, and this could be the most potent disinformation tool of all. Deep fakes means not merely the tampering with visual imagery with tools such as photo touch, but the whole cloth creation of media, or rather synthetic media, that is wholly or partially generated by AI, artificial intelligence. It's possible now to create highly believable fake visual and audio content at a scale that we've not experienced before, including the ability to take a person's biometric data and create an audio or video clip from whole cloth. So not even just altering an existing video, but creating a whole new video. And there's a growing commodification of the tools and services that allow this this deep fakery, which is lowering the barrier for non-experts to create deep fakes. So we're really just at the start of this tech revolution. And some have predicted that by the next American election in 2024, up to 90% of what is online will be synthetic media. So this is something that every state, business, and individual will have to try to protect themselves against. So these phenomena, narrowcasting, micro-targeting, viral disinformation campaigns, and deep fakes are all tech-enabled aspects of the information dysphoria we're experiencing in Western societies these days. But there's something else going on. Disturbingly, we're seeing that Western leaders are embracing a deliberate strategy of inducing information dysphoria in their populations. And perhaps the most insightful take on this development comes from a historian of the 20th century, Tim Snyder, who many of you will know, the author of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, and many other deeply academic books, has said that Americans, what Americans need to understand is not simply that the Russians hacked the last America or the 2016 American election. To what effect, that's not yet been established, but we do know that they interfered with some electronic voting machines and that they were sending out memes and disinformation through the social media platforms. But more insidious than this sort of simple hacking, Snyder says, is that the authoritarian philosophy and methods of the Russian regime have migrated to the West and are being employed by Western politicians and their supporters, most markedly by the recent Trump regime. And the Russian government's tactic of inducing information dysphoria was, of course, honed on its own population before being exported. Snyder says that really it's meant to support a certain kind of political equilibrium in Russia, in which the population is induced to tolerate as much as possible a state of oligarchy and radical inequality, and that these conditions are stabilized and institutionalized in Russia by way of a very steady, efficiently, and beautifully produced diet of fake news, complemented by a series of manufactured triumphs abroad. This is a certain model, he says. You fill the public sphere with things that aren't true, and you contradict yourself all the time. And then you blame journalists, the people responsible for factuality, and you talk about having to crack down on them. Then nobody knows what the truth is anymore. Nobody trusts the media. And what you end up with, and this is the payoff for the authoritarian leader, is a monopoly, or at least the strongest position in the manufacture of the symbols of the day. And symbols, as we know from history, are very powerful. Symbols appeal directly to people's emotions, to their grievances, to their mythologies of loss and redemption. And the emotion that we gain through our life experiences is often where our political beliefs spring from, not from facts or logic. So this authoritarian model that Snyder describes so well, we saw it play every day during the Trump regime. His handling of the pandemic crisis was a classic example of it. He said unpatently untrue things all the time. He sent mixed messages. He violated the public health advice that his own administration gave, holding large events without masks or social distancing. And I think it's important to understand that this was not mere incompetence or pathological mendacity, but rather that confusion, demobilization, the stirring up of emotion was regime policy. And the authoritarian idea behind this is that if there is no truth, there is only power. That is the object of inducing information dysphoria in a population. Democratic societies require a shared belief in factuality, a trust that we can at least agree on the methodology for ascertaining facts, and a belief that facts matter. If you destroy that belief, then you destroy democracy. And that, unfortunately, is what 21st century authoritarians have discovered. It's the cheap and easy way to destroy democracy. And that is what Snyder says is the process that is now underway before our eyes. If you add to this the debilitating culture wars taking place in the West, especially in the United States, you have a perfect storm. With these culture wars, we have populations that are especially vulnerable to information dysphoria and exploitation. Increasingly, they do not talk to people they disagree with. They do not live near people they disagree with, and they never have their views tempered. There's a constant expansion of what they hold sacred, these populations caught in culture wars. The ambit, and when I say what they hold sacred, that is the ambit of their ideas that can never be conceded, that can tolerate no challenge or disagreement. There's an unfortunate fetishizing of linguistic distinctions, a ratcheting up of political purity tests, a creeping extremism on all sides, and an abandonment of facts and narratives that do not fit one's confirmation bias, or the complete unmooring of facts that I described earlier, where attachment to facts is given up altogether, and there is only emotion, there's only power. Some of the ideas that hackers have been developing over the last 3 decades will be essential to countering the problem of information dysphoria. And I'm going to cover them briefly here, because there's so much else to talk about. And apologies to the technologists that might be in the audience. Certainly in a place like San Francisco, I know that you're well familiar with these principles, but this is really for the rest of us. The first hacker principle that I think will be very important in fighting information dysphoria is, of course, the principle of privacy for the weak. If you hang out in hacker circles, you will have heard this manifesto of the contemporary hacker scene: privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. Privacy guarantees autonomy and security in one's personal sphere and thoughts. If you're going to protect computer users from things like micro-targeting and disinformation campaigns, you have to guarantee them privacy online, control over their personal data, and freedom from state and corporate surveillance. Otherwise, their personal thoughts and feelings are going to be exploited. Hackers have been working for years to develop civilian encryption tools to secure the legal right to civilian encryption, and on a myriad of ideas for data self-determination. And of course, hackers have also been warning us for some time about the extent of state and corporate surveillance, the revelations of Edward Snowden being the most prominent example. The second hacker principle that is essential to countering information dysphoria is transparency for the powerful. Hacker Julian Assange and his organization WikiLeaks, of course, ushered in a new era of unprecedented transparency for the powerful, and they've been followed by many further leaking platforms. Transparency is the only antidote to misguided or corrupt governance, so that if government and corporations once held asymmetrical power to manipulate information flows, this is no longer the case. Now, of course, radical transparency of the type that WikiLeaks has brought to us brings new conundrums, but on the whole, I believe it's a salutary development in the digital political economy. The third principle that hackers have fought for is net neutrality. And net neutrality is something that ordinary users take almost for granted because it was built into the internet when it was created. But increasingly, it's being eroded. The net was neutral in that the basic protocol did nothing except to send information between servers. It was a decentralized network of networks with a default mode of interoperability. It did not monitor or discriminate against content or users. Anyone could participate, move around freely, speak and associate freely, and use it for their own purposes. In short, there were no gatekeepers. Hackers' fight for net neutrality is a fight that the common citizen has to understand for free communication. In the digital era, if you expect to decide freely what you listen to, watch, receive, send, publish, create, and even think as a citizen, net neutrality is essential. Net neutrality is also about the future of media and freedom of the press, which media outlets survive, what stories get told, and which are suppressed. The fourth hacker principle that is essential to countering information dysphoria is free software. And hackers have been proselytizing the value of free software for some time now. That is software that can be scrutinized, modified, built upon, and shared without restriction. Free doesn't mean giving it away free. It means that once free software is released, there are no restrictions to it. Once you acquire free software, it is in your control. You can fix it, adapt it, study it, pass it on, reproduce it, and improve upon it. And the idea that code should be in the control of computer users is really a bedrock principle of freedom and democracy in the digital age. And in the context of information dysphoria, it means that all code should be subject to study and review. There should be no hidden algorithms, malware, or operations perpetrated on people. Everything should be open to examination and a commons-based process of improvement. And this idea of free software is really related closely to one last hacker principle that I'll mention, and that is the hands-on imperative, the core tenet of what is known as the hacker ethos, according to Stephen Levy. The idea that access to computers and to anything else that might teach us how the world works should be unlimited and total. One should be able to take systems apart, to interrogate them, to study them, to improve upon them, and share them. Now, privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful, net neutrality, free software's freedoms, and the constant interrogation of computer systems in the public interest are big ongoing goals. Hackers never dream small. But let's talk for a moment about what the more immediate or discrete technical legal solutions being proposed to counter information dysphoria are, and how far they take us. Well, first, of course, there's fact checking. And there's many organizations and services now that do this. In the US, there's Snopes. AP has a thing called Fact Check. There's PolitiFact, which won a Pulitzer Prize for fact checking during the 2008 election. I might have been the 2016 election, but these are American fact-checking services. In Europe, there's Agence Presse France Fact Check, Full Fact, and BBC's Reality Check. And of course, the list goes on. Bellingcat is an open source fact-checking organization that focuses on information warfare. And then there's services that rate the trustworthiness of news and news sites. NewsGuard is an example that gives trust ratings for over 4,000 news and information sites. And it's researched by trained journalists. This is it doesn't use algorithms, but rather journalists to create these ratings. And you can subscribe to it on a monthly basis. And the big platforms are doing similar things with their algorithmic rankings of news sources and their labeling of inaccurate information. First Draft News and Partnership AI are working on a project about how to label synthetic media, since of course there's both malicious and benign uses of synthetic media. And journalism schools are pouring a lot of academic thought into how to make fact-checking more rigorous in a digital environment. Now, some commentators say that post hoc fact-checking doesn't work well because it occurs after the horse is out of the barn and most readers do not take the time to refer to it. But really, all of this comes down to whether one trusts the fact-checkers and the journalists and the broader problem in our society today of trust in institutions. And a questionable fact-checking or rating is very similar to censorship and suppression, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We know that many alternative news and content sites have been buried unjustly and unfortunately by algorithmic ranking, for example. The next tech solution that I'd like to talk about is detection. And this is a relatively new field aimed at detecting malicious synthetic media or deep fakes. Detection tools must, of course, be able to show both that a thing is fake and that it's real, or that fake things are fake and real things are real. And the latter is often the most important, because what disinformation actors really want is for people to question everything. So in precarious political contexts, like a coup or the shooting down of an airplane or a human rights violation, deepfakes can be manufactured with some effort to tip the situation, but false claims that something did not happen are much easier and faster to do and can be just as effective. DARPA's Metaphor was one of the first detection efforts. DARPA is, of course, the US military's Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. In early 2020, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and the Partnership on AI hosted a deepfake detection challenge, and there was a $500,000 prize for the winning submission. Google's nonprofit arm, Jigsaw, is developing numerous tech tools to detect disinformation. And the AI Foundation has developed a software product called The Assembler. Deep Trace is another company in this space. Now, one problem in deepfake detection is that tech cannot interpret the content, tech cannot interpret the context of faked video across different cultures, or even imagine how context could be recontextualized. And so, for example, you have those recently altered videos of Nancy Pelosi and Jim Acosta that went viral, and their speed had merely been tampered with to mislead viewers. These are so-called cheap fakes rather than deep fakes, and apparently there's no way right now to catch these cheap fakes, these recontextualized videos with technical methods. Another problem is in developing deep fake detection tools is that they require huge data sets and machine learning. And so, they involve corporate and government surveillance practices to acquire the data sets. And they are opaque, they're black boxes. You have to trust that they work. But perhaps the biggest problem with detection is that it's an arms race. And as the AI gets more and more sophisticated, there may be no certain way of detecting what is fake and what is real. And that is a future possibility that we're going to have to contend with. We might simply have to be able to live with that. The next solution, tech solution to information dysphoria that I'd like to mention is, and which is increasingly being discussed, is censorship by algorithms or deplatforming. And it's increasingly being advocated by progressives and Democrats, which seems counterintuitive, but they seem to be the majority now calling for that kind of solution. And I'll be frank here. That kind of censorship or deplatforming, first, I think it tends to put decisions in the hands of the monopoly platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter. And why would we want to do that? They, least of all, should be making those important societal decisions, acting as censors with secret algorithms for ranking and filtering information, when they have, of course, their own political and corporate agendas, and they are unelected entities. And I tend to agree with a recent piece by Thomas Frank in The Guardian in March in which he derides Democrats for their embrace of censorship. And he jokes about their horror of the uncurated world, of thought spaces flourishing outside the consensus, of unauthorized voices babbling freely in some arena where there is no moderator and there is no moderator to whom someone might be turned in. And Frank says that the diagnosis of the Democratic Party, the diagnosis that they give for their failure to win over the 73 million Americans in the 2020 election that didn't vote for them, including an increased number of Latinx and Black voters. This diagnosis that it was due to the malfunctioning of the public's mind due to fake news is simply wrong. And I'd agree with him on that. I think that, along with Frank, that rather their failure was due to their longstanding refusal over 4 decades to provide some kind of genuine vision of economic redistribution and social solidarity. But in any event, the idea that the remedy to that election failure, that failure to win over 73 million Americans to the Democratic platform, the idea that to censor and shut down speech is the remedy, is an abandonment of liberal principles. And it gives up on reason itself. Justice Brandeis of the US Supreme Court said that the remedy for bad speech is more speech. Criticism, analysis, humor, protest, these have always been the most effective way to counter bad ideas. And I think we should always remember that when censorship is being floated as a technical solution on digital platforms. A fourth tech solution is provenance tracking or verification, and it, on its face, seems to be a more palatable solution than censorship. And this is the use of watermarks and date stamping that can be built into digital photos and files to authenticate them when they're created, and then reveal whether they've been tampered with. And potentially, it could also involve capturing additional information about the movements of public figures to authenticate their movements and actions, so that these can be reconstructed if there's fake videos put out about them. But there's problems with this tech solution as well. The UK group Witness hosted the first cross-disciplinary expert summit on responses to malicious deepfakes in June of 2018, bringing together a large range of participants from technology, journalism, human rights, cybersecurity, and AI backgrounds to identify the trade-offs and the dilemmas in this area. And it noted that there was a range of stakeholders facing pressure to validate their media. And so you saw the launch of projects like the News Provenance project. I believe that was a New York Times project funded by IBM, and the Content Authenticity Initiative, various initiatives from companies like Twitter, Adobe, and news agencies. And the dangers that Witness identified were that if we start capturing verification data for each image, video, and audio recording, what you're going to end up with is companies governing large amounts of personal data. You're going to be encouraging the adoption of a disbelief by default culture. And ultimately, you'll be enabling those with the most power and access to engage these services. And you'll have a digital divide with those organizations and individuals that can afford to do this, and the rest that cannot. So there's problems with that tech solution also. briefly, what might be some of the legal solutions, the legal regulations that we could bring in to combat information dysphoria? I mentioned at the outset the idea that code is law, that computer code, more than law, is going to determine the kind of societies we live in and whether they end up resembling democracies at all. And what I meant by that is not that law is irrelevant, but rather that the normative force of code is so strong that we must begin to think about law in new ways. And I came to this conclusion as a lawyer, as I saw over the last decade or more, how the old regimes were no longer working, older privacy regimes, data protection, and other kinds of regimes. And I think that's because what we have to do is think about how to get the normative force of law to work along with the stronger normative force of code to nudge, incentivize, or disincentivize, or facilitate what the code is doing. So there are things that the law could do. If we had the political will to do them. We could ban micro-targeted ads, for example. We could ban political ads on digital platforms altogether. We can criminalize incitement to violence, and most countries have done that. And that would apply to online speech. We can prohibit platforms like Facebook from delivering news, or make platforms pay for the news that they use, and thereby provide a new economic model for supporting independent investigative journalism. We could certainly adapt trust-busting laws to break up or at least tamp down some of the tech monopolies. The European Union, for example, is no longer looking at price control as an indicator of monopoly power, but rather attention control as the key indicator. And the EU, I think, is generally ahead of North America when it comes to legal ideas for legal regulation. Even a few years back, the EU Parliament's Civil Liberties Committee was looking at imposing a democracy tax on social media, upgrading the new GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, to address algorithmically processed data, and instating an ethical pause on the use of online political ads. So those are some of the proposed solutions. But, we shouldn't kid ourselves. Information wars have always existed. Governments and powerful interests have always manipulated populations. And as I said, in the mid-20th century, there was manipulation going on too. The mainstream media monopolized a scarce resource, radio and television waves, and to a large degree, manufactured consent among the population. But, back in the 20th century, if people were manipulated into consenting to established power structures and conventional viewpoints, at least they were manipulated together. It was relatively easy to get the public to cooperate in public health initiatives, for example. There was little access to alternative viewpoints. Mind you, one has to remember that mainstream media manufactured consent to public policy. It was no guarantor of good policy. And those of you who grew up in the 50s and 60s will remember that you'll remember the public health initiative that got people to cooperate in eradicating polio, which was a good thing. But you'll also remember the drug campaign that got pregnant women to use thalidomide for morning sickness, which was a bad thing. In the current landscape, where tech has fractured the media and unleashed information dysphoria on the population, the problem is really how to manufacture consensus. And I gave a whole speech on this last fall at a communications conference in the context of getting populations to comply with public health directives in the pandemic. And I think that metaphors are very helpful in dealing with complexity. And I note that a lot of speakers at this festival are using the metaphor of pollution, of a polluted information ecosystem. And I use it myself. I use that metaphor myself in my book because I think it helps one point both to corporate responsibility, but it's also concerned with systems and systems feedback and systemic failure, the idea of systemic failure. But over the last week, I found myself thinking not of that particular metaphor, but rather a very different one. And that is the metaphor of the Tower of Babel. This is a myth or ancient narrative that's been used before to describe polarization in politics. And really the idea that God punished humans for their hubris in building a tower that would reach to heaven by making them speak all in different languages so that they couldn't understand each other is very apt for the current time. Once again, humankind has built something that brings us closer to the gods, the internet, digital tech, and we are being punished. We cannot understand each other. We cannot even tolerate each other anymore. And if we don't address that, if we can't find some level of social cohesion that allows our democratic systems to function, we will end up with more authoritarianism, violence, and possibly even civil war. And I thought it was very interesting as I started to explore this idea, because I didn't know a lot about the Tower of Babel. So I did some research. And did you know that it occurs in multiple cultures? Stories of people building a tower and being scattered or punished in some manner have reportedly been told not just in Genesis, the Old Testament, but also in Greco-Roman mythology, in parts of northern India, by the Toltecs in the 1500s to Spanish invaders, by Central African tribes in the 1800s. And it may be that it's a similar story appearing in different cultures, or it might be the retelling of the same original story. But I think that its ubiquity speaks to the power of the narrative in describing what is a recurring human dilemma. And so I went looking for images of this Tower of Babel to better contemplate the story. And I found a bunch on Wikimedia in the public domain and under Creative Commons licenses that I wanted to share with you. And I'm going to do that now. I have to get this set up on Zoom. The captions are my own. So let me see if I can do this. I'll have to share my screen. And there are the photos. So I'll just scroll through them and let you contemplate them yourself. Some fascinating images by artists over the years of the Tower of Babel. Oh dear. And now we have to live with this complexity. And I want to make sure that I've stopped the screen sharing. And now we have to live with this complexity. This is the curse of our invention. This is our dilemma. As discussed earlier, tech solutions often come with their own attendant problems, and legal solutions are deeply enmeshed with the tech. But even when problems are parsed carefully to look for the best tech solution, how can we really expect technology to repair a weakened and imperiled civic space? The danger, I think, of putting too much emphasis on the technical fixes is that we treat the computer as some kind of magic oracular machine. And the problem may not be the plurality of information sources or even the trustworthiness of some of them. It's that we rely too heavily on computers for information, discourse, connection, and solutions. Tech tools don't heal the deepest problem. Google Translate is not going to solve the speaking in different tongues problem, the problem of social cohesion when it comes to information dysphoria. Only culture, only our shared values, our shared cultural values can begin to get at this. And here I'd like to give the example of Estonia, which was hit in 2007 by a series of aggressive cyber attacks against its media, government, and banking systems. Estonia believed that Russia was behind the assault, though Russia denied it. But Estonia took a society-wide approach to shoring up its defenses that involved technological solutions, but more importantly, engaged citizens. The long-term national defense strategy that it announced in 2010 emphasized psychological defense, which it defined as the development, preservation, and protection of common values associated with social cohesion and the sense of security. So where can we look within our own liberal democratic tradition to save us from information dysphoria, from the Tower of Babel? What can we draw on from this tradition to help us? At the heart of liberal democratic philosophy is the belief that the ideal society, or the best among worst options, is a society in which individuals are able to achieve the highest degree of autonomy consistent with the autonomy of others. So that while to live among others is to accept certain constraints and responsibilities, liberal democratic theory holds that everyone in a free society should be able to think and generally to live as they want. Liberalism's penetrating insight, articulated by one of its most prominent philosophers, Isaiah Berlin, was to suggest that the most dangerous person in the world is the person who believes he has discovered the meaning of life. For once a person is totally convinced of his own moral rightness, once he is persuaded that he is in possession of the true answer, the one true answer that will transform an unjust and divided world into an earthly paradise, then he will inevitably feel justified in using whatever means possible to make that vision a reality. And Berlin also observed that moral certainty readily becomes an alibi for political violence. So the great wisdom of our liberal democratic tradition is that it is critical that we preserve a space where people with different political viewpoints can talk to each other and where we can conduct politics. And cleaving to that wisdom, I think, is really going to be our best defense countering the threat of information dysphoria in this new century. And there's a second great part of the liberal democratic tradition that I want to touch on as well. And that is the tradition of civil disobedience, allowing or at least valuing culturally a certain amount of transgressive dissident behavior and thought to challenge mainstream thinking and power structures in every era. And since City Lights is a sponsor of this event, and it has nourished its share of the great dissident voices and poets in North America, allow me to quote the Canadian poet Leonard Cohen's perfect expression of the idea, and that is that there is a crack in everything that's how the light gets in. And I'm going to go far out on a limb and practice these two great traditions, a political space where we can have autonomous thought and agree to disagree if necessary and not demonize each other, and dissident thought itself, in order to give you a concrete example to think about. And this example comes from Hollywood. I read about it recently in Wired magazine. I read about an app that a coder, she happens to be a Black woman coder, which is unusual, is developing for some of the Hollywood studios to use. And to take this all with a grain of salt, because it was a short article and I might have been misinterpreting what her true intent was. But I think it's a good example of how we have to be very careful about the realization of our own political ideas in technology. And we have to come to both the political space, but also the design and technical space with great humility and openness to other ideas and to refining ideas, and maybe even choosing not to try to affect our ideas through technological means. So let me continue with this example to tell you what I'm thinking about. So this app, Hollywood studios today recognize that the need for diversity. At least studio heads are saying that they do, but they're also saying that they can't find minority workers. So this app was really meant to be a directory for the many Black people working in film, to give them visibility to employers so that they could be hired. And studios would no longer have the excuse of saying that they couldn't find them. But the detail that caught my eye at the end of the article was that the developer said that the next step in the app, in the development of this app, was going to be creating the ability to provide demographic breakdowns for each production. And as a labor and a human rights lawyer, my head reeled when I read that. I am completely on board with the goal of increasing the participation of minorities, especially historically marginalized and oppressed minorities in the workplace and in leadership roles. I'm fully sympathetic to the Black Lives Matter movement. And I know that statistical underrepresentation in a workforce is circumstantial evidence of systemic and/or overt racism. It means that there are barriers to entry and retention there, some of which are probably discriminatory, some of which may not be discriminatory, but it's a good marker. Underrepresentation is a good marker of discrimination. But this idea, this sort of logical next step in the technological solution, that we could then provide demographic breakdowns for every production, every movie production, is alarming, because what would we do? Would we be requiring people to self-report identities according to prescribed categories so that we could have the app do this? And which categories would those be? Well, probably those in human rights legislation, although you would have to choose the legislation, and maybe not those in human rights legislation. Maybe it would be the more popular categories that people are talking about in Hollywood now, of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But there's potential problems with that. Apparently, a majority of Latinx, Latino people do not consider themselves to be people of color, while their advocates insist that they are. In Canada, we still use the term visible minority in Stats Canada. In Stats Canada statistics, although it's been criticized as a concept because it lumps together too many kinds of people with who are facing very different barriers, which each need to be analyzed individually on their own merits. And some human rights codes include socioeconomic status, which is roughly equivalent to class, which is very controversial. The other thing that was alarming to me was that workers have rights to privacy. There may be all kinds of reasons that workers don't want to report the grounds within human rights legislation. They may not want their employer to know they have a disability, like a substance addiction, or their family situation, or their criminal record, because they may believe that they may not believe they'll get the accommodation from the employer that the law requires, and that instead they will suffer for revealing these identities. They may not want to give all the details of their ethnic and racial background either. They may not believe in your project, in your app. They may think it's reductive or divisive or ineffectual. They may mistrust how it's going to be deployed or fear its unintended consequences. Or just disagree with you on very bald political grounds. So, are we going to force them to report, to carry a race report card throughout the industry to every studio employer and every production they apply to? Something like a vaccination passport that people have been talking about in the pandemic. Will we do this just because the information technology is capable of creating a system like it? And then again, your methodology, is it going to be exact proportional representation of each minority in a workforce? And what are you going to compare it to? The general population, the labor pool of the nation, of the state? Are you saying this is a North American industry, or are you going to look at the particular, be sensitive to the unique demographics of the different countries that you work in as a global corporation making movies? And then finally, how do we even achieve proportional representation when everybody has intersectional identities? If you add up all the individual identities, so for example, you might have a female who is also Asian, disabled, and a single parent, you will get more than 100% because people have more than one identity and will be counted multiple times. Will you have caps for existing minority workers? Say you've been successful in an industry and including a particular minority, will they now be subject to caps because you have too many of them? And I'm going to propose to you that what starts out as a good idea with tech fixes can very quickly become a very bad idea, and a bad idea amplified in its effects, because we know that tech amplifies our actions. It amplifies our policies in exponential ways. And the illiberal impulse at the heart of this particular tech solution, this hypothetical app, and I'll call it hypothetical because I'm just riffing on this article in Wired magazine. The illiberal impulse at the heart of it is to force people to report in order to effect what you believe is the solution for achieving a more just society. Existing law might stand in your way, existing privacy law might stand in your way, but you might still succeed in pressuring people to report voluntarily if the app is adopted by powerful employers and the normative force of code overtakes the normative force of law. So the lesson that I would like to draw for you from this concrete example is that be careful what you design. what starts with good intentions could well end up becoming social engineering by surveillance and algorithm. And that is a caution that we must always place before us in the digital age. So, I went far out on a limb for you, especially with an American audience, but I think that transgressive or dissident thought is so important because it acts as in liberal democratic societies, because it acts as corrective feedback in systems, and it can nudge a system to recalibrate and become more robust or resilient. In my book, I talk a lot about corrective feedback in systems, both in the context of how social movements have historically succeeded, and also in the context of theories from social science, eco-science, and legal constitutional theory. And I, in fact, have a whole chapter on the value of transgressive acts, riffing on the idea of hackers' transgressive acts being corrective feedback, and even Berlin's graffiti, and more recently memes being corrective feedback. So before I end today, I want to share with you, we were asked by the event organizers to provide oblique strategies for confronting technological bias. And those of you who might know about oblique strategies, this is really the use of flashcards that contain some gnomic expression or suggestion, some aphorism or remark meant to help one break deadlock or a dilemma situation. And so the dilemma situation is information dysphoria. And I'm going to share with you the oblique strategies that I provided. Let me just share my screen. Oh, and I think you can see that now, or that's the wrong, keep switching to the wrong. There it is. All right. So here are my oblique strategies for countering information dysphoria, deep fakes, micro-targeting, Russian trolls, bubble capture, creeping extremism, one zone or others, illiberal impulses, and authoritarianism. Study history and listen for its rhymes. It is the test of a good religion, whether you can joke about it. Join a bowling club. Always choose the big tent. Always act in a way where you widen the options to act. The most dangerous person in the world is the one who believes he knows the sure path to utopia. And so in conclusion, Karl Marx posited that transformative technology brings down the whole superstructure of a society, its social hierarchies, the role of labor, its distribution of wealth, the way it defines value, and the law that underpins it all. In the early part of the 21st century, we're in the midst of such a transformation. Likely, we will be engulfed in an unimaginably complex information, misinformation, disinformation ecosystem that will change many things. Our culture in the West has made us vulnerable to information dysphoria, but it's also our greatest strength. Using our cultural advantages, our liberalism, our pluralism, our penchant for always questioning systems, we have a chance of finding our way through to a new democratic way of being. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Maureen. I really appreciated the fact that you brought the poetic into the discussion and Leonard Cohen. So we do have some questions. Let's see. Let me start with Catalin. Obviously, information, be it actually informing or disinforming still takes up data. Tension with regard to the relationship between current capacities and the technologies of storing digital information on one hand and the environmental affairs on the other.
We're breaking up in the first part of that question.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, let me we'll try again, and hopefully this connection will keep up. So do you see any tension with regard to the relationship between current capacities and technologies of storing digital information on one hand and the environmental affairs on the other?
Well, what that question might be referring to is the environmental impact of cloud storage, I believe. That's a very real concern. We think of the cloud as being some ephemeral, benign, lovely space that allows us to store all our photos and videos for free. But in fact, it has a huge physical footprint and a big carbon imprint too. And so all of these systems are based on massive storage capacities. And in some ways, that's been the quantum leap that's allowed a lot of this technology, and certainly AI, to go forward in the last decade or so. AI and machine learning, depends on ginormous amounts of information sets. So will there be some finite limit to all of this ingenuity based on our environmental limits is a very important question.
I have another question asked from an anonymous attendee. In Chomsky's manufacturing consent, posited that politicians, media, and educators be believers in order for the masses to be manufactured.
Oh dear, you're breaking up again. This is so apt because
sorry.
It's like we're speaking in tongues to each other. That was
bad connection here. So sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So sorry about that. Okay, let me, I'll try again. In Chomsky's manufacturing consent, he posits that politicians, media, and educators must be believers in order for the consent of the masses to be manufactured. Do you believe that's changed?
I'm sorry, the first part of that again was?
In Chomsky's manufacturing consent, he posited that politicians, media, and educators must be believers in order for the consent of the masses to be manufactured. Do you think that's changed?
Well, I mean, if that were ever true, I think there's so much cynicism in government, and there always has been. So, I think there has to be an intent to manipulate is the main criteria. And we are very easily manipulated. I started understanding that myself as I wrote this book, because I was, obsessively reading news stories and researching and sort of going down numerous rabbit holes of information, and really began to understand that, if you read things, if you get very expert in certain things, or you read certain things all the time, or you follow certain things, you're very susceptible to have that be the center of your attention, and to also to be believing those arguments. And it often takes another actual person in front of you disagreeing with you to temper your views. And I think this is all a very recent phenomenon. So it made me understand that even the most critical thinkers, we're all susceptible to manipulation. It's part of the human condition.
John comments, the internet may have made the traditional propaganda governments use harder, since there are no longer a relative number of media channels that entire populations access. Do you think an issue may be that some of the governments are still working in the old paradigm? For example, how badly thought out or conveyed some of the official messaging from governments on COVID has been, regardless of the misinformation already out there?
Yeah, I think it's varied from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some governments were more successful in their messaging. We had a public health official here in BC that people wrote songs about. They loved her so much, and even you go to, I don't know, you'd see friends, you'd be going for socially distanced walks, and people say, well, Bonnie Hendry tells us that we ought not to, and maybe she's right, maybe she's wrong, but we're going to do what Bonnie says, So, I think that the trick to good messaging is, well, you've got to earn people's trust, right? So, I think that institutions, you gain institutional trust by serving the public's interest over many years. That's how you gain trust. There's no magic to it. It's not about communications. And then I guess the other thing that I would say would be that while I spoke just now about the very fractured media landscape, I was surprised to consider how important TV still is in politics. And when I visited Spain and I talked to some of these hackers and people that were doing these guerrilla politics with Partido X and stuff like that, they talked about Podemos and how Podemos came to power, and this is just another wrinkle, is that the real left the hacker, the Indignados movement, a lot of them are not happy with Podemos. We think of them here as being the leftist heroes that came to power in Spain, but they are reviled in many progressive circles in Spain, and as a sort of being a co-option of a last-minute co-option of the Indignados movement. And apparently their power was built on TV because their guy, Ingleses, I think was his last name, he was on TV 7 nights a week practically. He was a popular television figure. And despite that's the Spanish population, including the older population, being some of the most sophisticated digital networkers, they do a lot of politics online, and it's cross-generational. They were still not able to, when they looked back at the election and saw how well Podemos did compared to some of the other leftist groups, they realized that it was TV. It was the penetration of TV into people's households still. It was still a major factor. Yeah, so.
I think we have time for one more question. How can radicals, progressives position ourselves in a new political space and digital where conservatives cry censorship and the liberals cry for more censorship? Are alignments with conservatives with regards to free speech on the horizon?
Well, I hope so. And I think if you take away anything from my talk today, I think what we really have to hold on to, the center, there's another poet that's been quoted, Yeats has been quoted a lot, his line, the center will not hold. I think the center that we have to hold on to is this basic fundamental tenet of our liberal democracy, which is that we have to have a neutral space, a safe space, a space free from violence and demonization and vitriol, where we can do politics, where we can have different ideas, where we can agree to disagree. Otherwise, we get whipped into more and more dogmatic views of the world, and a fellow Canadian of mine, Wade Davis, wrote an article that went viral called "The Unraveling of the United States" that some of you might have read, where he expressed his love for your country and his great admiration of your country, but just this horror at seeing it unravel. And I think this at the heart of it is that there's too many illiberal impulses that are being acted upon, and whether you believe that you know how to build a more just society, you have to bring the rest of your fellow citizens along with you. It is a long and hard process that will involve many tactics and strategies, but at the heart of your society is this sacred space where you can do politics with your neighbor, where you can speak with your neighbor, and that's what I hope that we can hold on to in this digital maelstrom of the 21st century.
Thank you so much, Maureen Webb, for being part of Revisions. This has been a really fantastic presentation. It's given us so much to think about, and I hope you'll come back into our orbit once again in the not too distant future. Also, thank you for all of you in the audience for joining us today. I'd like to remind everyone we're posting links in the chat function with which you can purchase books. We're selling copies of Coding Democracy, as well as Maureen's previous book, Illusions of Security. So please check that out. Also, this session is going to be followed by another at 3 p.m. today. It's going to be Nita Atanasowski and Kalin Devora. The presentation is called Surrogate Futures, Technology, Race, and the Human. If you haven't already, please do register for that. Also, check out the Revisions portal to view the whole festival calendar. There's much more coming up, many more events and workshops. Also, today's event is going to be rebroadcast on the Gray Area website. So in case you know of anyone who missed it, or if you'd like to watch it again, please check it out. This event was sponsored by the City Lights Foundation, a 501c nonprofit carrying on the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti. The City Lights Foundation fosters an active engagement with books and literary culture. Our public events, publishing program, and educational outreach are dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope to see you all again soon. Please be well.
Thank you.